The dust of Willow Bend was a fine, red powder that settled on everything and in everything. It coated the unpainted planks of the general store, filled the cracks in the boardwalk, and worked its way into the lungs of man and beast alike. It was the first thing you tasted in the morning and the last thing you scrubbed from your skin at night. A constant, gritty reminder that this land was not meant to be tamed. Here, in the Dakota Territory, circa 1870, God had drawn a hard line between the living and the dead, and the folks of Willow Bend spent their days trying to stay on the right side of it. Law was a suggestion, whispered from a traveling judge who passed through twice a year. Survival was the only scripture that mattered, and its verses were written in sweat, calluses, and the quiet, stubborn set of a man's jaw. In this world of harsh realities, Eleanor Hartley was a misplaced line of poetry. At 23, she possessed an education that was as useless here as a silk fan in a blizzard. The Reverend and Mrs. Gable, the missionary couple who had raised her from an orphaned babe, had filled her head with scripture, her fingers with piano scales, and her tongue with proper English. She could read Milton, debate the finer points of Deuteronomy, and stitch a sampler so delicate it looked like a spider had spun it from colored dew. But she couldn't skin a rabbit, mend a harness, or tell by the sky if a storm was a passing shower or a world-ending deluge. Her hands were soft, her back was straight, and her eyes held a gentle, questioning light that was ill-suited to a place that demanded answers be given quickly and often at the end of a gun. Her world, fragile as it was, had shattered 2 weeks prior. The fever came on the wind, a hot, merciless breath that paid no mind to piety or position. It took the Reverend first, silencing his booming sermons in 3 short days. Mrs. Gable, a woman who had faced down blizzards and rattlesnakes with grim determination, followed him a week later, her final breaths a weak sigh in the suffocating quiet of their small cabin. Eleanor was left alone. The town's charity was as swift and unsentimental as its justice. They buried the Gables in the rocky plot behind the church, and before the dirt had even settled, the town's unofficial council convened on her porch. It consisted of 2 men who embodied the twin pillars of Willow Bend society: Silas Croft, the blacksmith, whose thick arms and soot-stained face spoke of honest, back-breaking labor, and Jedediah Kane, the saloon owner, whose tailored vest and smooth, watchful eyes spoke of the business of men's vices. They did not waste time on pleasantries. Mr. Croft, his voice a low rumble like stones grinding together, came straight to the point. "Miss Hartley," he began, twisting a worn hat in his massive hands, "the town grieves with you. The Gables were good people, but grief don't fill a belly or keep a roof over your head. You've no people, no means of your own. A woman alone out here. It ain't right. It ain't safe." Eleanor sat on the porch swing, her hands folded primly in her lap. She felt a cold dread creeping up her spine, a fear far more profound than the grief that had hollowed her out. This was the fear of helplessness. "I understand, Mr. Croft. I will find work." Jedediah Kane let out a soft chuckle, a dry, rustling sound. "Work," he said, his smile not reaching his eyes. "Darlin', the kind of work available ain't suited for a lady of your sensibilities. Mucking stalls, tanning hides. You'd last a day. A woman's work is in the home, Mr. Croft stated, as if reciting a commandment, and a home needs a man. It's the natural order of things." The trap was being set, and Eleanor could feel its steel jaws closing around her. "What are you suggesting?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "We've spoken to Bartholomew Finch, Mr. Croft said, his tone one of finality. "His wife passed last winter. He's got 40 acres of good land, 3 children to raise, and no woman to run his house. He's a good, sturdy man. He's agreed to take you as his wife. The wedding can be in a week's time." Bartholomew Finch. The name conjured an image of a man made of the very earth he tilled squat, silent, with hands like shovels and eyes that never seemed to blink. Eleanor had seen him in town, had seen the grime permanently etched into the lines of his face. She had seen his children, 2 boys and a girl with old, tired faces and clothes that were more patched than fabric. To marry him would be to trade one form of servitude for another. She would be a housekeeper, a field hand, a vessel for his needs. Her music, her books, her very soul would wither and die in the dust of his farm. She swallowed hard, the taste of bile in her throat. "No," she said, the words small but clear. "I thank you for your concern, but I will not marry Mr. Finch." Mr. Croft's face darkened with incomprehension. He looked at her as if she'd just spoken in a foreign tongue. "You won't, girl. This is not a courtship. This is a provision. It's this or you starve." It was then that Jedediah Kane stepped forward, his shadow falling over her. He smelled of whiskey and cheap perfume. "Now, Silas, don't be so grim," he said smoothly. "The lady is entitled to her preferences. Perhaps a life of domestic drudgery doesn't appeal. I have another position available." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a confidential murmur. "The lucky ace could always use a pretty new face. My patrons are hard-working men, lonely men. They appreciate a woman who can pour a drink, share a smile, maybe offer a bit of companionship to ease their burdens. I'd give you a room upstairs, food, pretty dresses, protection. All you'd have to do is be agreeable." His meaning was as clear as the cheap whiskey he served. He wasn't offering her a job as a barmaid. He was offering her a cage with velvet lining. She would be property, passed among the grimy, calloused hands of strangers, her worth measured in coins and fleeting moments of purchased attention. The thought made her skin crawl, a profound and violating chill that went deeper than the evening air. The Reverend Gable had preached of hellfire and damnation, but Eleanor had never imagined it would have a name like the Lucky Ace Saloon. Both options were a kind of death. One was a slow smothering, the other a quick burn to ash. For a moment, the vast, terrifying emptiness of her future paralyzed her. She saw the 2 paths laid out before her, each leading to a different kind of oblivion. The town saw her as a problem to be solved, a loose thread to be woven back into the rough fabric of their society. One way or another. They didn't see asterisk her asterisk. They didn't see the girl who dreamed of the sea she'd only read about in books, who found more comfort in a verse of Keats than in any sermon. And in that moment, something shifted inside her. It was a tiny, hard kernel of defiance she didn't know she possessed. It was the pride Mrs. Gable had instilled in her, not the pride of vanity, but the pride of self-worth. It was the belief, however faint, that her life was her own, not a commodity to be traded for safety or sustenance. She stood up, her small frame seeming to gain a strange new strength. She looked both men in the eye. "Mr. Croft," she said, her voice steady now, "I will not be a man's property for the price of a meal. Mr. Kane," she continued, turning to the saloon owner, "and I will not sell what's left of my soul for the price of a drink. I decline both of your generous offers." Silence. A thick, shocked silence hung in the air. Jedediah Kane was the first to break it, a genuine, mirthless laugh escaping his lips as he shook his head in disbelief. "Mr." Croft simply stared, his face a mask of stone-cold disapproval. To them, she was not just ungrateful, she was a fool, a child throwing a tantrum in the face of reality. "Then you leave us no choice. Miss Hartley." "Mr." Croft said, his voice flat and cold. "This cabin belongs to the church, to the next preacher they send. You are a ward of this town no longer. You have until sunrise to be gone." He turned and stomped down the porch steps without a backward glance. Jedediah Kane lingered a moment longer, a predatory glint in his eye. "The offer stands." "Darlin'," he purred. "When the prairie teaches you its lesson, you'll know where to find me." Then he too was gone, melting into the dusk. Eleanor didn't watch them go. She went back inside the cabin, the familiar scent of wood smoke and dried herbs doing little to comfort her. The choice had been made. Or rather, she had chosen not to accept their choices. She had chosen the unknown, a third path that led off the edge of the map. Her packing took less than 10 minutes. There was so little to take. She folded her spare calico dress and a wool shawl into a small canvas satchel. Beside them, she placed her mother's silver locket, containing a faded miniature portrait of two faces she had never known. She took the small, leather-bound Bible from the gable's nightstand and a thin volume of poetry that had been her most treasured possession. That was it. The sum total of her life fit into a bag that was pitifully light. As the first pale fingers of dawn stretched across the sky, painting the horizon in shades of gray and rose, Eleanor stepped off the porch for the last time. She did not look back at the cabin, nor at the shuttered windows of the town that slept on, indifferent to her fate. She set her face east, towards the rising sun, and walked. The prairie opened up before her, a vast, rolling sea of grass under an endless sky. It was beautiful and terrifying in its immensity. The silence was absolute, broken only by the whisper of the wind through the blue stem and the soft crunch of her worn boots on the dry earth. She was a single, solitary figure in a landscape that cared nothing for her existence. She walked for hours, the sun climbing higher, beating down on her bonneted head. The town of Willow Bend shrank behind her until it was just a smudge on the horizon, and then it was gone completely. She was truly alone. By afternoon, the sky began to change. On the western horizon, a bruise of dark purple clouds gathered, their edges churning with a sickly yellow light. A low, distant rumble, more felt than heard, vibrated through the soles of her feet. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of rain and ozone. It whipped her skirts around her legs and tore at her bonnet, a wild, mournful sound that seemed to mock her foolish hope. The storm was coming. It was a living thing, a great angry beast gathering its strength to pounce. The sky grew darker, the sun blotted out by a spreading stain of black. Jagged forks of lightning clawed at the horizon, followed seconds later by thunder that cracked like the sky itself was breaking apart. Eleanor kept walking, her pace quickening with a rising panic. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The prairie offered no shelter, no trees, no caves, nothing but the endless, exposed grass. She was a single, defiant soul standing against the full, impartial fury of nature. And as the first cold, heavy drops of rain began to fall, she couldn't help but feel that this was it. This was the fate she had chosen to be swallowed whole by the vast, unforgiving wilderness. Her pride and her poetry washed away into the mud. The sky broke. It was not a rain, but a deluge, a vertical river that fell from a bruised black sky. The world dissolved into a churning chaos of water and wind. The prairie, moments before a sea of grass, became a landscape of liquid mud. Each blade bowed in surrender. The wind was a physical beast, shoving and tearing at Eleanor, stealing the breath from her lungs and plastering her thin calico dress to her skin until she was shivering with a cold that seeped into her very bones. Thunder cannonaded directly overhead, a deafening crack that vibrated through the ground, followed by a ground-shaking roar that felt like the world's final, agonizing groan. In the brief, strobing flashes of lightning, the landscape was a nightmare of sharp, unnatural contrasts, the flattened grass a sickly green, the rising water a slick, malevolent black. She ran, though she didn't know from what or to where. It was a primal, mindless flight, driven by the pure terror of a small creature caught in the open. Her boots, never meant for such terrain, became leaden weights, caked in inches of thick, sucking mud. The ground beneath the water was a treacherous secret of ruts and holes. Her foot plunged into one of them. There was a sickening twist, a snap of bone or sinew that sent a bolt of white-hot agony screaming up her leg. She cried out, a sound instantly swallowed by the storm's roar, and collapsed into the ankle-deep water. the cold, gritty mud rushing in to embrace her. She tried to push herself up, but the moment she put weight on her left foot, the world dissolved into a nauseating wave of pain. She fell back with a gasp, her head splashing into the murky water. This was it, the end. Her foolish pride had led her here, to die alone and unseen in a muddy ditch, her body to be found days later by coyotes, her books and her Bible to be rendered into a pulpy, meaningless mush. A bitter, hysterical laugh tried to bubble up from her chest, but it turned into a choked sob. She had refused to be owned by the men of Willow Bend, only to be claimed by the indifferent, violent land itself. Through the shrieking wind and the curtain of rain, another sound registered, a rhythmic, heavy splashing. It was too steady to be the storm. Lifting her head, her matted hair clinging to her face, she peered into the gray gloom. Another flash of lightning bleached the world white, and in that instant, she saw it the silhouette of a man on a horse. Not 50 yards away. He was not moving away or toward her, but sitting perfectly still, an impossible statue in the heart of the chaos. Fear, cold and sharp, lanced through her, momentarily eclipsing the pain in her ankle. An Indian, the word screamed in her mind, a phantom echo of Reverend Gable's sermons. Asterisk savages, godless heathens who roam the plains, preying on good Christian folk. Their ways are the ways of the wolf, their hearts are stone. She scrambled backward, trying to crab walk away, the movement sending fresh waves of agony up her leg. Her satchel, her last worldly possessions, was torn from her grasp by the current and began to float away. The rider urged his horse forward, the animal's powerful legs churning through the water with an unnerving calm. As he drew closer, details emerged from the maelstrom. He wore buckskin leggings and a simple tunic, all of it soaked dark with rain. Long black hair was plastered to his high cheekbones and strong jaw. He carried no rifle that she could see, but a sheathed knife was visible at his hip. His face was a stoic mask, his dark eyes fixed on her with an intensity that she couldn't decipher. It wasn't lust, it wasn't anger, it was something else, something ancient and unreadable. He dismounted in a single but fluid motion, the water swirling around his knees. He ignored his horse, which stood ground-hitched and steady, as if accustomed to its master's strange errands in the middle of a deluge. He walked toward her, his steps deliberate and sure. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs. She was cornered, injured, helpless. This was a fate worse than Bartholomew Finch, worse than the lucky ace. This was the violent, godless end the Reverend had always warned her about. He stopped a few feet from her, his gaze dropping to her unnaturally angled ankle, then back to her face. He said nothing. The silence from him was more terrifying than any war cry. He reached a hand out toward her. She flinched violently, pressing herself back into the mud, a small, pathetic whimper escaping her lips. For the first time, an emotion flickered in his eyes, not pity, but perhaps a kind of weary understanding. He let his hand drop. He turned and retrieved her floating satchel, his movements economical and unhurried. Then he returned, wading past her to a spot on the small rise she had fallen from. He knelt, his powerful hands digging into the muddy turf, pulling away the grass. He was testing the ground. After a moment, he seemed satisfied. He looked back at her and spoke, his voice a low baritone, nearly lost in the wind, but the words were English, albeit spoken with a thick, unfamiliar cadence. "Shelter," he said, pointing to a low bluff barely visible in the distance. "Come." It was not a request. He waded back to her, and before she could protest or shrink away, he bent and scooped her into his arms. The movement was surprisingly gentle, yet overwhelmingly strong. She was lifted from the cold mud as if she weighed nothing. Her head fell against the solid wall of his chest, the smell of rain, wet leather, and something else, something wild and earthy filling her senses. A terrified cry died in her throat. She was utterly at his mercy. He carried her to his horse, placed her sideways on its bare back, and then swung up behind her in one seamless motion. His left arm came around her waist, holding her securely against him. The contact was shocking. Through their soaked clothes, she could feel the heat of his body, the solid muscle of his torso. It was the most intimate contact she had ever had with a man, and it was happening with a stranger, a savage, in the middle of a biblical storm. She squeezed her eyes shut, her mind a whirlwind of terror and confusion. The horse moved, picking its way through the treacherous terrain with an intelligence that seemed almost human. Eleanor clung to the animal's mane. Her body jostled with every step, a fresh throb of pain shooting from her ankle. The man behind her was a silent, warm presence, a human shield against the wind and rain that now beat against his back instead of hers. She should have been fighting, screaming, but all the strength had been leached out of her. There was nothing left but a cold, trembling exhaustion. The ride could have lasted 5 minutes or an hour. She had no sense of time. Finally, the horse stopped. He dismounted, and once again, lifted her into his arms. He carried her toward the bluff, disappearing into a dark cleft in the rock that she hadn't been able to see from a distance. Inside, the roar of the storm was instantly muted, reduced to a distant, angry rumble. The air was cool and dry. It was not a deep cave, more of a wide, hollowed-out overhang, but it was sanctuary. He gently set her down on a patch of sandy ground, her back against the rock wall. For a moment, he just stood over her, his silhouette framed by the gray, rain-swept light of the entrance. Then he set to work. From a leather pouch at his side, he produced a piece of flint, steel, and a small bundle of tinder wrapped in oilcloth. With a speed and efficiency that seemed like magic, he had a small, smokeless fire crackling to life in a shallow pit near the cave's mouth. The flames pushed back the gloom, casting flickering, dancing shadows on the rock walls. The warmth began to seep into Eleanor's chilled limbs, a feeling so welcome it was almost painful. She watched him, her fear now mingled with a reluctant awe. He moved with a quiet, powerful grace, every action having a purpose. He laid out a piece of hide near the fire for her to rest on, then turned his attention to her injured ankle. He knelt before her, and she instinctively tried to pull her leg away. He placed a firm, steadying hand on her calf. It wasn't rough, but it communicated an undeniable authority. "Stay," he said, his voice soft but firm. His fingers probed the swollen, bruised flesh around her ankle with a surprising delicacy. She winced, biting her lip to keep from crying out. His touch was clinical, impersonal, yet she was acutely aware of the warmth of his skin against hers. After a moment, he looked up, his dark eyes meeting hers in the firelight. "Broken," he said simply. It wasn't a question. He took his knife from its sheath. A fresh wave of terror seized Eleanor, and she shrank back, her eyes wide. He ignored her reaction, using the large blade to carefully slice away her soaked leather boot and the bottom of her stocking, exposing the grotesquely swollen and discolored joint. Then, from another pouch, he produced a small bundle of dried leaves and roots. He crushed them between 2 stones, mixed them with a little water from a skin, and created a dark, fragrant poultice. He gently applied the paste to her ankle. It was cool at first. Then a spreading warmth seeped into the joint, dulling the sharp edges of the pain. He worked with intense concentration, his brow furrowed. He found 2 flat pieces of driftwood near the back of the cave and, using strips of leather from his pack, he fashioned a crude but effective splint, immobilizing the joint completely. Throughout it all, he did not speak, and in his silence, Eleanor's own mind began to work. The Reverend Gable's words about soulless savages warred with the reality of the man in front of her. A savage would have left her to die in the storm. Or worse, a savage would not have known how to build a fire in a deluge, or how to set a broken bone with such gentle expertise. A savage would not have a face that, in the flickering firelight, looked less fearsome and more weary. She could see the fine lines around his eyes, the solemn set of his mouth. This was not a monster. This was a man. When he was finished, he sat back on his heels. He produced a piece of dried meat from his pack. It was dark and hard, unlike any food she had ever seen, and offered it to her. She hesitated for a moment. Then her gnawing hunger won out. She took it, her fingers brushing his. The meat was tough and smoky, but it was the most delicious thing she had ever tasted. As she ate, he finally spoke again. "I am Lakota." She swallowed the dry meat. "Eleanor," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Eleanor Hartley." Lakota nodded, as if filing the name away. He did not ask her what she was doing alone on the prairie, or where she had come from. He simply sat by the fire, his presence a quiet, calming anchor in the swirling sea of her emotions. He took a piece of the dried meat for himself and ate slowly, his gaze alternating between the fire and the storm still raging outside. An hour passed. The storm began to abate, its fury lessening to a steady, drumming rain. The fire crackled. Eleanor, exhausted and overwhelmed, felt her carefully constructed worldview beginning to crumble. Everything she had been taught, everything she had believed about the world and its dangers, was being called into question. The men of her own kind, her supposed protectors, had offered her degradation and servitude. They had shown her a charity that was cold, pragmatic, and conditional. This man, this Lakota, a man she had been taught to fear and despise, had shown her nothing but kindness. He had saved her life, tended her wounds, shared his food, and offered her shelter, all without asking for a single thing in return. He had given her something she hadn't realized she'd lost until this very moment, a sense of safety. Here, in a cave with a Lakota warrior, she felt more secure than she had at any point in the last 2 weeks in the heart of Willow Bend. The realization was so profound, so utterly disorienting, that tears began to well in her eyes. They weren't tears of fear or pain, but of a deep, soul-shaking confusion. She turned her head away, ashamed for him to see her cry. She must have drifted off, because the next thing she knew, the cave was darker. The fire banked to low, glowing embers. The rain had stopped. Outside, the world was dripping and quiet. Lakota had laid a buffalo hide over her. He was sitting on the other side of the fire, his back against the rock wall, his eyes closed. Whether he was asleep or merely resting, she couldn't tell. She lay there, listening to the steady, quiet rhythm of his breathing, a sound that was strangely comforting. The man who was supposed to be a danger, a threat from a savage world, was her sole protector, and in the deep, silent dark of the cave, Eleanor Hartley understood that she had just taken her first, terrifying step into a world far larger and more complicated than any book or sermon had ever described. Eleanor awoke to a world washed clean. The storm had passed, leaving behind a sky of impossible, aching blue and air so fresh it felt like the world's first morning. Sunlight streamed into the mouth of the cave, painting a brilliant gold rectangle on the opposite wall. The steady drip of water from the rock ledge outside was the only sound. Lakota was already gone from his spot by the dead fire. A moment of panic, sharp and cold, seized her. What if he had left her? But then she saw him, just outside the cave's entrance, speaking in low, soft tones to his horse. The animal's head was bent, nuzzling his shoulder. It was a moment of such quiet, peaceful intimacy that it felt wrong to watch. He moved with the same unhurried grace she had noted before, a man perfectly at home in his own skin, in his own world. He saw her stir and came back inside, carrying a water skin. He offered it to her without a word. The water was cool and sweet. As she drank, he knelt and gently unwrapped the leather strips from her splint, his fingers examining his own handiwork in the clear morning light. The swelling had not worsened, and the poultice had stained her skin a dark green. He nodded, seemingly satisfied, and retied the splint with firm, practiced motions. "Sun is high," he said, his voice the first sound to break the morning stillness. "I take you to town. Fort Laramie is 2 days east." The words struck her like a physical blow. Fort Laramie, a white man's town. It would be larger than Willow Bend, perhaps, but the people would be the same. The rules would be the same. A woman alone, injured and destitute, would be seen as a burden or an opportunity. She would face the same terrible choices of forced, loveless marriage to some stranger who needed a domestic servant, or a life of shame in a saloon, selling smiles and comfort in the upstairs rooms. The despair she had held at bay since he'd rescued her came rushing back, a suffocating tide. "No!" she whispered, the word catching in her throat. She tried again, forcing strength into her voice. "No, please." Lakota stopped what he was doing and looked at her, his dark eyes searching her face. His expression was patient, questioning. He was waiting for an explanation. How could she make him understand? How could she explain the suffocating judgment, the cold pragmatism that masqueraded as charity, the utter lack of hope that awaited her in a world that was supposed to be her own? "In your world," she began, struggling for the words, "I have no place. I have no family, no money. The choices they give a woman like me, they are not choices, they are cages. One is a life of servitude to a man I do not know. The other—" She faltered, the shame of Jedediah Cain's offer making her cheeks burn. "The other is a life of public ruin. I would rather have died in the storm than go back to that." The confession hung in the quiet air of the cave. She had laid her soul bare to this stranger, this man from a world she knew nothing about. She expected him to look at her with the same incomprehension as the men of Willow Bend, to see her as a foolish, hysterical female. Instead, he held her gaze, his expression unchanging, but a new depth of understanding seemed to dawn in his eyes. He had seen the desperation in her when he found her in the mud, but now he understood its source. It was not the storm she was running from. It was her own people. "Where will you go?" he asked, his question simple and direct. This was it, the precipice. Behind her was a life of quiet degradation. Before her was an absolute, terrifying unknown. She took a breath, the clean, wild air filling her lungs, and made her leap. "With you," she said, her voice small but clear. "If you will let me, I can work, I can learn, I have nowhere else to go." He was silent for a long time. He looked at her splinted ankle, at her torn and mud-stained dress, at her pale, determined face. He was weighing her, measuring not her worth in the way of white men what she owned, who her father was, but something else. Her spirit, perhaps, her resilience. The silence stretched on, and Eleanor's fragile hope began to wither. She had asked the impossible. Why would he take on this burden, this useless white woman who knew nothing of his world? Finally, he gave a single, slow, deliberate nod. "We leave now," he said. Relief washed over her so powerfully her head swam. It was a feeling so potent, so pure. It was almost painful. For the first time in her life, she had not been told what her path would be. She had chosen it. The journey began with the awkward intimacy of him lifting her onto the horse. She settled behind him, her hands hovering uncertainly in the air for the first few minutes, not knowing where to put them. But the horse's gait was jarring, and to keep from falling, she had to place her hands on his waist. The buckskin of his tunic was soft beneath her fingers, and she could feel the solid muscle of his back. A blush crept up her neck, but necessity quickly overrode her modesty. This was about survival, not propriety. They rode for 2 days across a landscape that was breathtaking in its scale and stark beauty. The prairie rolled on forever, a tapestry of green and gold under the vast dome of the sky. Lakota was a silent guide, but his silence was not empty. It was watchful, attentive. He would occasionally point, A single, subtle gesture toward a herd of antelope flowing like a tawny river in the distance, or a lone hawk circling on a thermal high above. He was reading a language written on the land, a language she was only just beginning to understand existed. Their stops were brief and efficient. He would help her dismount, find her a comfortable place to rest her back against a rock, and share his food, the same dried meat and some kind of nutty, crushed berry cake. He showed her how to find a sweet, edible root and which berries were safe to eat. They were simple lessons, but to Eleanor, they were revelations. She was learning not from a book, but from the world itself. The nights were the strangest. They made a small, nearly invisible fire. He would give her the thicker of the 2 buffalo hides he carried, taking the thinner one for himself. He slept a few feet away, a silent, reassuring presence in the immense, star-drenched darkness, lying there, listening to the chirp of crickets and the distant howl of a coyote. Eleanor felt a profound sense of peace that she had never known. She was vulnerable. Yes, completely dependent on the kindness of this man she had met only 2 days ago. But she was also free. The weight of Willow Bend's expectations had been lifted. Out here, she was not the Reverend's orphaned ward, or a prospective wife, or a potential saloon girl. She was just Eleanor, a woman who had chosen to ride into the unknown. Late in the afternoon of the second day, he pointed toward a low line of hills. "My home," he said. As they drew closer, she saw smoke rising into the air, thin white plumes against the blue sky. Then the village came into view, nestled in a wide, grassy basin near a meandering creek. It was not the chaotic, filthy caricature the Reverend had described in his sermons. A collection of perhaps 24 teepees stood in a wide circle, their painted hides glowing a warm, creamy color in the afternoon sun. They were graceful, conical structures, many adorned with symbols and paintings of horses and buffalo. The air smelled of wood smoke and roasting meat. The sounds were those of life dogs barking a welcome, children laughing as they chased each other, the rhythmic thud of a woman beating a hide, the murmur of conversation. Their arrival brought the village to a halt. The children stopped their games, their happy shouts dying on their lips. The women looked up from their work. Men who had been talking in small groups turned to watch them, their faces guarded, their eyes missing nothing. A white woman, bedraggled and injured, riding with Lakota. The sight was a stone dropped into the calm pool of their afternoon. Eleanor's newfound courage faltered. She felt 100 pairs of eyes on her, and in them she saw suspicion, curiosity, and a cool, impenetrable reserve. She was the outsider, the other, her dress, her skin, her very existence was an intrusion. She instinctively shrank behind Takakota's broad back, wishing she could disappear. He paid the stairs no mind, guiding his horse calmly toward the center of the camp. Before he could dismount, a small girl with wide, dark eyes and 2 long, black braids broke away from a group of women and ran toward them, her small legs pumping. "8," she cried out, her voice clear as a little bell. "Asterisk, Father Asterisk." The transformation in Takakota was instantaneous and absolute. The stoic, unreadable warrior vanished, replaced by a father whose face was lit with pure, unguarded love. He swung down from the horse before it had even fully stopped and swept the child into a fierce embrace. Burying his face in her hair, he spoke to her in the soft, flowing cadences of his own tongue, and she answered in a torrent of excited chatter, her small hands patting his cheeks. Watching them, Eleanor felt a lump form in her throat. This was the part of him she had not seen, the heart of the man, the widower, the father. The little girl, still cradled in his arm, suddenly fell silent. Her gaze had fallen on Eleanor. She tilted her head, her black eyes wide with a child's frank curiosity. She pointed a small, chubby finger. Takakota turned, his expression softening. He said something to his daughter in Lakota, and her hand dropped. He helped Eleanor down, his grip on her arm strong and careful, mindful of her splint. The little girl watched her every move, her head cocked to the side like a curious bird. "This is Mika," Lakota said to Eleanor in English. "My daughter." Mika took a hesitant step forward. She looked at Eleanor's pale face, her strange, faded dress, and the clumsy splint on her leg. Then she reached out and gently touched the sleeve of Eleanor's calico dress, her fingers tracing the tiny, floral pattern as if it were the most wondrous thing she had ever seen. The gesture was so innocent, so free of the adult's wary judgment, that it nearly broke Eleanor's heart. Lakota led her toward one of the larger teepees on the edge of the circle. The eyes of the village followed them, silent and watchful. As they reached the entrance, an older woman with a face like a beautiful, wrinkled map and eyes as sharp as obsidian chips emerged. She looked at Eleanor, then at Lakota, and began to speak in a low, rapid torrent of Lakota. Her tone was not welcoming. Lakota answered her calmly, his voice never rising. His explanation was short and direct. The woman's gaze swept over Eleanor again, critical and assessing. She let out a grudging grunt, then disappeared back into the teepee. "My wife's mother, Kanku," Lakota said by way of explanation. The inside of the teepee was surprisingly spacious. A small fire pit sat in the center, a thin wisp of smoke rising to the opening at the top. The ground was covered with furs and woven mats. It was clean, orderly, and felt like a home. Kanku returned with a bowl of steaming broth. She thrust it into Eleanor's hands without a word, her expression still grim. But the broth was warm and rich, and Eleanor knew it for the act of grudging hospitality that it was. As Eleanor drank, Mika crept closer, settling on the furs beside her. She watched Eleanor with her solemn, unblinking eyes. After a moment, she held out a small, worn object on the palm of her hand. It was a little horse, carved from a piece of smooth, dark wood, a treasured toy, an offering. Eleanor looked from the carved horse to the little girl's expectant face. A tentative, fragile smile touched Eleanor's lips for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. She reached out and gently accepted the gift. Later, as darkness fell and the village settled into the rhythms of the night, Eleanor lay on a soft bed of buffalo hides. Through the tippy walls, she could hear the murmur of voices, the occasional laugh, the barking of a dog. These were the sounds of a life she did not understand, in a world she did not know. She was frightened and her ankle ached. But as Mika, who had refused to leave her side, fell asleep with her small, warm hand resting on Eleanor's arm, a strange sense of peace settled over her. She had made her choice. She had thrown herself upon the mercy of the unknown, and in the trusting touch of a small child, she felt the first tentative flicker of hope that she might just be able to build a home here. The weeks that followed were a slow, painful, and profound education. Eleanor's life, once measured by the turning pages of a book or the chime of a clock for evening prayers, was now governed by the sun's arc across the sky, the coming of the frost, and the persistent, gnawing demands of survival. Her first lesson was in humility. With her ankles still healing, she was confined to the area around Lakota's teepee, a world that was both vast in its newness and constricting in her inability to navigate it. She became a student to the two people who shared the small, conical space with her, a 5-year-old girl and a stern, silent grandmother. Mika was her first and most enthusiastic teacher. The little girl, a whirlwind of energy and innocent chatter, appointed herself Eleanor's constant companion. She would point to everything, naming it in a clear, high-pitched voice: asterisk, teepee, kanpi asterisk, firewood, asterisk, wazi asterisk, pine tree, asterisk, money asterisk, water. Eleanor, with the clumsy tongue of an adult learning a new language, would repeat the words, her pronunciation often sending Mika into fits of giggles. Yet the child's laughter was never cruel. It was a shared joy. And through it, Eleanor began to build a vocabulary of the world around her. Kanku, Takakota's mother-in-law, was a far more formidable instructor. The old woman's face was a roadmap of a hard life, her eyes sharp and missing nothing, her mouth set in a permanent line of disapproval. She saw Eleanor not as a guest, but as a burden, a useless, pale-skinned mouth to feed. Kanku's lessons were not given. They were demanded. She would thrust a bowl of corn into Eleanor's lap and a grinding stone into her hands, then watch with hawk-like intensity as Eleanor struggled, her soft, unpracticed hands fumbling with the unfamiliar weight and motion. More often than not, Kanku would snatch the tools away with a grunt of disgust, her own gnarled, powerful hands finishing the task in a tenth of the time. There were no words of encouragement, only the stinging shame of failure. Eleanor learned to pound dried buffalo meat and fat together with berries to make wasna, a food that could sustain a hunter for days. She learned which roots were for medicine and which for stew, how to sew with an awl and sinew instead of a fine needle and thread. Her delicate stitches from the mission school a laughable memory. Her hands were the first part of her old self to die. The soft, pale skin that had known nothing rougher than a piano key was soon a geography of blisters, cuts, and scratches. The first time she scraped a deer hide alongside the other women. The lye solution and the sharp flint scraper left her hands raw and bleeding. She cried that night, not from the pain, but from the sheer, overwhelming feeling of her own inadequacy. She hid her tears from Takakota and Mika, turning her face into the buffalo robe. Takakota, who was often away for a day or two at a time hunting, would return and observe this slow, painful transformation in silence. He saw Kanku's harsh tutelage and Eleanor's quiet, dogged determination. One evening, after a particularly trying day where Eleanor had ruined a supple piece of buckskin by cutting it incorrectly, he intervened. He found her sitting outside the teepee, staring at her raw hands as the sun went down. He came and sat beside her, not on the log where she sat, but on the ground, a position that felt less imposing. He held out a small, greasy pouch. "This helps," he said, his English simple and direct. He took some of the salve, a mixture of bear fat and mashed herbs, and gently, wordlessly, began to rub it into her palms. His touch was firm and impersonal, yet the simple act of care was so unexpected it made her throat tighten. "I am no good at this," she whispered, the confession tasting like ash. "I try, but I ruin everything. Kanku is right. I am a burden." He finished with one hand and started on the other, his gaze fixed on his work. "Your hands are soft," he stated. It was not an accusation, merely a fact. They were taught to hold books. Now they learn to hold tools. The lesson is hard. The skin will grow. He looked up from her hands and met her eyes. "It is not the book or the tool that matters. It is the learning. Your spirit is not soft." His words were a balm, more healing than the salve on her skin. He was not like Reverend Gable, whose praise was a reward for perfect recitation and whose corrections were sharp rebukes for failure. Takakota saw not the mistake, but the effort. He acknowledged the struggle and honored it. From that day on, he became her teacher as well. His lessons were different from Kanku's, where Kanku taught by sharp correction. Takakota taught by patient demonstration. He showed her how to read the weather in the clouds, how to distinguish the tracks of a deer from those of an antelope. He taught her the names of the constellations, telling her the Lakota stories behind them, so different from the Greek myths she had read. Under his tutelage, the world began to open up, to make sense in a way it never had before. But while she was slowly finding her place within the small circle of Takakota's teepee, the village at large remained a wall of suspicion. Her presence was an anomaly they could not reconcile. To some, she was a ghost, a bad omen. The women would fall silent when she approached the creek to fetch water, their conversations resuming in hushed, rapid Lakota only when she had passed. A young warrior named Chaitan, whose eyes held a perpetual, angry fire, would often stare at her, his contempt a palpable force. She once heard him arguing with Lakota, his voice sharp, spitting the Lakota word for white woman, *wazitu*, like a curse. The isolation was a heavy cloak. There were days she felt as alone as she had on the prairie during the storm. It was Mika who saved her from sinking into despair. The child was a bridge to the rest of the community. She would grab Eleanor's hand and pull her into a group of children, forcing Eleanor to participate in their games. Children, unlike their parents, were mostly curious. They would touch her pale hair, marvel at the blue of her eyes, and laugh at her clumsy attempts to speak their language. Through them, Eleanor learned that a smile was a universal language, and a shared game could break down barriers that adult words could not. Lakota was her other shield. His acceptance of her was a clear, unspoken statement to the rest of the village. He never forced others to speak to her or include her, but his own actions were enough. By allowing her to mend his moccasins, to cook his food, to walk beside him through the camp, he conferred upon her a status and a protection that no one dared to openly challenge. He was a respected warrior, and she was under his care. That was enough to keep the open hostility at bay, even if it could not erase the whispers or the cold stares. The true healing, the real weaving together of their disparate lives, happened in the evenings, around the soft, glowing heart of the teepee's fire, as darkness fell and a deeper and star-dusted silence settled over the plains. The three of them would gather in its gentle light. The fire was a world unto itself, a place of warmth and safety where the harsh judgments of the day melted away. At first, Eleanor was a silent observer, listening to the soft murmur of Lakota and Mika's Lakota, feeling like a ghost at their feast. But as her language skills grew, she began to participate. It started with Mika. The little girl would ask Eleanor to tell her a story, stumbling over words, using gestures and the few English nouns Mika knew. Eleanor would recount the tales of David and Goliath, or Noah and his ark, to Mika, who knew stories of the trickster, Iktomi, and the great Buffalo Nation. These were strange and wonderful new legends. Lakota would listen, his face unreadable in the flickering light, sometimes offering a quiet correction to her Lakota, turning a fumbled phrase into a coherent sentence. In return, he would share his own stories. He told her of his wife, Mika's mother, a woman named Tassina who had been swift and laughed often, and who had been taken by the coughing sickness 2 winters ago. He spoke of her not with crippling grief, but with a quiet, abiding love that made her feel present in the teepee, a gentle spirit watching over them. One evening, after Mika had fallen asleep nestled between them, Eleanor found the courage to share her own story. In her halting, broken Lakota, mixed with English when the words failed her, she told him of the Gables, of Willow Bend, of Bartholomew Finch and Jedediah Kane. She spoke of the terrible choice she had been given, and the choice she had made instead. He listened without interruption, his dark eyes never leaving her face. The fire crackled, the only sound in the intimate darkness. When she finished, her voice thick with the memory of it all, he was silent for a long time. "They saw a sparrow with a broken wing," he said at last, his voice a low rumble, "and they offered it a cage. They did not think it could learn to fly again." His understanding was so complete, so perfect, that it brought tears to her eyes. He saw her, not as a white woman, not as a burden, but as a person who had fought for her own freedom. She looked down at her hands, resting in her lap in the firelight. They were no longer the hands of Eleanor Hartley, the educated girl from the mission. They were crisscrossed with pale scars, the palms thick with calluses, the nails chipped and dirty. They were strong. They were the hands of a woman who could feed herself, who could build a fire and scrape a hide. They were the hands of a woman who was learning not just to survive, but to live. A sense of profound peace settled over her. The path ahead was still long and fraught with uncertainty, The suspicion of the village was a real and present shadow. But here, in the warm glow of this small fire, flanked by the quiet warrior who had become her teacher and the sleeping child who had become her friend, she was not alone. This small circle of light was the foundation of a new life, a life she was building with her own 2 hands. The season turned. The last of the summer heat gave way to crisp, cool mornings that left a silver filigree of frost on the tall prairie grass. The days were a frenzy of activity as the village prepared for the long, cold months ahead, the time they called the season of the popping trees. And then the hunters returned. They came like a slow-moving storm on the horizon, their triumphant cries echoing across the basin long before they arrived. The hunt had been a great success. The pack horses were heavily laden with buffalo meat and hides, enough to see the village through the winter with full bellies and warm robes. A wave of joyous relief washed through the camp, a palpable release of communal anxiety. That night there would be a celebration. Eleanor felt the thrum of excitement in the air, a feeling she could now share. She was no longer the helpless outsider. Her hands, now calloused and capable, worked alongside Kanku and the other women, slicing the fresh meat into thin strips to be smoked and dried. Kanku's attitude toward her had softened from icy disapproval to a kind of grudging respect. Eleanor was a hard worker. She was good to Mika, and she was learning their ways. It was not friendship, but it was a form of acceptance. And to Eleanor, it felt like a monumental victory. When she saw Lakota ride in, she felt a swell of something she dared not put a name to. He sat tall on his horse, a leader among the other men, his face streaked with the dust of the hunt, his expression one of weary satisfaction. Their eyes met across the bustling camp, and in that brief, silent exchange, she felt a connection that was more profound than any words. It was a jolt, a current that left her feeling both breathless and deeply centered. As evening fell, a massive bonfire was lit in the center of the camp circle, its flames leaping high into the indigo sky, sending sparks dancing toward the stars. The air, rich with the savory smell of roasting buffalo ribs, soon filled with a sound that was as old as the hills themselves, the deep, resonant heartbeat of the drum. The villagers gathered, their faces painted and their clothing adorned with the finest quillwork and beads. The firelight danced on their skin, turning the familiar faces of her neighbors into mythic figures. Eleanor sat on a robe with Mika, feeling the familiar mix of being both a part of and apart from the scene. She wore a simple buckskin dress Kanku had given her, softer and more practical than her worn calico. It felt strange and wonderful against her skin. The drumming grew louder, faster. The men began to dance first, their movements powerful and energetic, telling the story of the hunt, the stalking, the chase, the final, respectful kill. Eleanor watched, mesmerized. This was not the stiff, formal dancing of a church social in Willow Bend. This was life itself, a raw, vibrant expression of gratitude and strength. Then the women joined, their dance more fluid and graceful, their feet moving in a complex shuffle that was deceptively simple. Mika, caught up in the energy, jumped up and began to mimic them, her small body a whirlwind of joyous, uncoordinated movement. Eleanor stayed seated, her heart pounding in time with the drums. A part of her yearned to join, to feel that rhythm in her own blood. But fear held her back. She was the outsider, the white woman. She did not know the steps. She would be a clumsy, laughable intrusion. It was then that Lakota appeared before her, emerging from the firelit chaos. He had changed into a clean tunic decorated with porcupine quills that shone in the light. He looked at her, his dark eyes seeming to hold all the warmth of the bonfire. He did not speak. He simply held out his hand. It was an invitation, but it was also a challenge. Her breath caught around them. The noise and movement of the celebration seemed to fade into a dull roar. All she could see was his outstretched hand, All she could hear was the frantic beat of her own heart. This was more than just a dance. To take his hand would be a public declaration, an acceptance of her place not just in his teepee, but in his life. The eyes of the village were on them. She saw Chaitan, the hostile warrior, scowling from the edge of the firelight. She saw Kanku watching, her wrinkled face an unreadable mask. Her fears screamed at her to refuse, to stay in the safe shadows. But then she looked at Takakota's face, at the quiet confidence in his eyes, and she saw not a demand, but a promise of support. She put her trembling hand in his. His grip was warm and strong, engulfing hers completely. He led her into the swirling circle of dancers. The world became a dizzying kaleidoscope of fire, shadows, and moving bodies. The drum was inside her now, a physical vibration in her chest. She was clumsy, her feet tangling, her body stiff with self-consciousness. She felt a hot blush of shame creep up her neck. Takakota's hand moved from hers to the small of her back, a steady, reassuring pressure. He leaned close, his voice a low murmur in her ear against the thunder of the drums. "Do not think," he said, his breath warm against her skin. "Listen to the drum. It is the heart of your mother, the earth. Feel her heartbeat in your feet." She closed her eyes for a second, forcing herself to do as he said. She stopped trying to remember the steps she had been watching and focused on the sound, on the solid ground beneath her, on the firm guidance of his hand, and slowly, miraculously, something shifted. Her body began to move, not with the grace of the other women, but with a new, tentative rhythm. She was no longer fighting the music. She was a part of it. She opened her eyes and looked at him. He was smiling, a rare, small smile that transformed his stoic face, making him look younger. In that moment, surrounded by the wild music and the primal energy of the dance, all pretense fell away. The looks they exchanged were raw, honest, and filled with a feeling that was as undeniable as the fire that raged beside them. It was not just affection, not just gratitude. It was something deeper, something that was being forged between them, stronger than culture, stronger than fear. When the song finally ended, they stood for a moment in the breathless aftermath. The cheers of the other dancers a distant sound. The intensity of what had just passed between them was overwhelming. Eleanor felt exposed, her heart laid bare for all to see. She needed to breathe, to find a quiet place to still the frantic spinning of her thoughts. "I need some water," she stammered, pulling away from his warmth. She slipped through the crowd, her face burning, and headed toward the path that led down to the creek, leaving him standing in the firelight. The cool night air was a shock after the heat of the fire. Down by the creek, the sounds of the celebration were muted. A rhythmic pulse carried on the wind. The moon was nearly full, casting a trail of shimmering silver across the dark, murmuring water. She knelt and splashed the icy water on her face, the cold a welcome distraction from the turmoil inside her. The dance had shattered her last defense. She could no longer deny the truth she had been trying to bury for weeks. She was in love with Takakota. She loved his quiet strength, his patience, the gentleness he showed his daughter, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled. But the admission of love was immediately followed by a flood of fear, a cold tide that threatened to drown her. How could she, Eleanor Hartley, ever be a true partner to a man like him? Her mind went to Tassina, his first wife. He had spoken of her with such deep, unwavering love. Tassina had been a Lakota woman, born of this land, a woman who knew these songs and dances in her bones. She had known how to be a wife to him, a mother to his child, in a way Eleanor never could. Eleanor felt like a pale, inadequate ghost trying to take the place of a vibrant, living memory. How could she compete with a woman she had never met, a woman who was perfect in his memory? And then there was the chasm of their two worlds. The dance had been exhilarating, but it had also been a stark reminder of how different they were. She was learning. Yes, but could she ever truly belong? Could she ever be enough for him? The deepest, most shameful fear coiled in the pit of her stomach. He was a man, a widower who had known the intimacy of marriage, and she was a child in that regard. The mission school had taught her that the physical union between a man and a woman was a duty, a private, almost shameful necessity for procreation, shrouded in vague warnings of sin and consequence. She knew nothing of passion, nothing of the body's language. She was utterly, completely innocent, and she was ashamed of it. Her ignorance felt like a failing, another way in which she was inadequate, unprepared for the life of a real woman, especially a woman who hoped to be loved by a man as real as Lakota. A twig snapped behind her. She looked up, her heart leaping into her throat, and saw him standing at the edge of the trees, a dark silhouette against the moonlit sky. He had followed her. He walked toward her slowly, stopping a few feet away, giving her space. "The fire was too hot for you?" he asked, his voice soft. She shook her head, unable to meet his eyes, and stared at the shimmering water. "My thoughts were too loud," she admitted in a whisper. He was silent for a moment, waiting. He would not push her. He would let her find her own words. That patience was one of the things she loved most about him. She knew this was a crossroads. She could retreat into her fear, or she could step forward into the terrifying, beautiful truth. She chose the truth. "In my old life," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "I was never chosen. I was assigned. The Gables took me in out of Christian duty. The men of Willow Bend tried to assign me a husband, a role to fill, like a piece of property. They saw a space that needed filling, not a person." She finally found the courage to look up at him. His face was cast in moonlight and shadow, his expression intent. "Here," she continued, her voice growing stronger, "I have been learning to be useful, learning to be strong, but tonight, when you took my hand, I felt something else. When I am with you, I feel seen for who I am, not for what I can do, or what role I can fill. When I am with you, I feel chosen, and I feel like myself, for the very first time." The confession hung in the cool, clear air between them. He closed the distance and knelt in front of her. He reached out, not to pull her into a rough embrace, but with a gesture of infinite tenderness, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw, his thumb gently stroking her cheek. "Eleanor," he said, his voice a low, deep rumble that seemed to vibrate through her very soul. "From the day I found you half drowned in the mud of the storm, I have chosen you. I saw the spirit in you that refused to be broken." Her heart soared, but he wasn't finished. He held her gaze, his eyes dark and serious. "But my choice is not what matters most. In my world, a man can choose a woman, but for a bond to be strong, for it to be true, she must also choose him. With a free heart, your choice, Eleanor, is the one that gives us a future." He was not claiming her. He was not assuming her heart. He was affirming her freedom, the very thing she had walked out onto the prairie to find. He was offering her a partnership, a bond between two people who chose each other, freely and completely. The fear about Tessina, about their different worlds, about her own inadequacies, it didn't vanish, but it receded. It became smaller in the face of this profound, empowering truth. He was not asking her to be Tessina. He was asking her to be Eleanor. Tears welled in her eyes, but for the first time in a long time, they were not tears of sorrow or fear. They were tears of overwhelming, incandescent joy. He pulled her gently into his arms, and she went without hesitation, resting her head against his chest, feeling the steady, strong beat of his heart beneath her ear. It felt like coming home. They stayed by the creek for a long time, wrapped in the quiet intimacy of his embrace, the distant, pulsing drum of the celebration, a faint echo of the world outside their own. The moon climbed higher, and the air grew colder. But Eleanor felt nothing but the steady warmth of his body and the profound, grounding peace that had settled in her soul. He had chosen her. She had chosen him. It was the simplest and most powerful truth she had ever known. Eventually, he stirred. "Mika will be sleeping," he said softly. "Kanku will have taken her to the teepee. We should go in from the cold." She nodded, reluctant to leave the bubble of moonlight and silvered water where her life had just been irrevocably changed. He stood, pulling her to her feet with a gentle strength. Her ankle, which she had almost forgotten, gave a twinge, and he immediately steadied her, his arm circling her waist. They walked back to the village, slowly, his body a solid support beside hers. The great bonfire had burned down to a mountain of glowing, orange embers, and only a few stragglers remained, their voices low and sleepy. The camp was settling into the deep quiet of the night, as Lakota had predicted. Mika was a small, still lump under a buffalo robe, fast asleep. Kanku was not there. She had likely returned to her own teepee, granting them a privacy that was both a blessing and a terrifying prospect. The air inside the teepee was warm and close, smelling of wood smoke and sage. The small central fire pit held a few glowing coals, casting a soft, flickering red light that made the space feel sacred and secret. Lakota added a few small pieces of dry wood, and the flames lazily revived, pushing back the shadows. He turned to her. The look in his eyes held a new depth, a new intensity. The patient teacher, the protective friend, those men were still there, but now there was also a man looking at the woman he had chosen. The air grew thick, charged with an unspoken question. Eleanor's heart, which had been so full of peace by the creek, began to hammer against her ribs with a new, frantic rhythm. This was the natural next step, the physical consummation of the choice they had both made, and the fear she had pushed aside came roaring back, a cold, paralyzing wave. He must have seen the change in her face, the sudden terror in her eyes. He reached out and cupped her cheek, his thumb stroking her skin. "Eleanor," he asked, his voice a low whisper. All the anxieties she had felt by the creek, her inadequacy, her ignorance coalesced into one burning point of shame. The words tumbled out of her before she could stop them, a raw, desperate confession. "Lakota, she swallowed, her throat dry. "I've never been with a man." She said it as if admitting to a crime, a fundamental failing. She dropped her gaze to the furs on the ground, unable to look at him, her cheeks burning with a heat that had nothing to do with the fire. She expected him to be disappointed, perhaps even annoyed. She was a woman grown, yet she was bringing a child's ignorance to their union. He did not pull his hand away. He was silent for a long moment. And in that silence, her shame festered. Then, he used his hand on her cheek to gently tilt her head up, forcing her to meet his gaze. There was no disappointment in his eyes. There was no judgment. There was only a profound, searching tenderness. "And I," he said, his voice quiet and even, "have never been with you." The simplicity and sincerity of his words stunned her. He was not dismissing her fear. He was meeting her on it, making them equals in this new territory. "In your world," he continued, his eyes holding hers, "what have you been taught of this?" "That it is a wife's duty," she whispered, shamefully. "A quiet thing, for making children. That it is a woman's burden and a man's release." The words of the Reverend's wife came back to her stern. Clinical warnings about a wife's obligation, to be endured with piety and fortitude. A shadow of something sadness perhaps passed over Takakota's face. He shook his head slowly. "That is the way of a master and a servant. It is not the way of a husband and a wife. Not in my world." He led her to the thickest pile of buffalo robes near the fire and sat, pulling her down to sit beside him. He kept hold of her hand, his thumb stroking her knuckles, a small, repetitive gesture that was incredibly soothing. "To join two bodies is not a duty," he said, his gaze on the dancing flames. "It is a ceremony. It is a story that two people tell only to each other. It is not about taking, it is about giving. It is not about knowing what to do. It is about learning, about trust." He turned his full attention back to her. "You have learned a new language for your tongue. You have learned a new way for your hands to work. This is the same. It is a new language for the body, and we will learn it together. There is nothing to fear in learning." His words were a gentle key, unlocking the cage of shame and fear that had imprisoned her. He was not demanding a performance from an experienced partner. He was inviting her on a journey of discovery. He was offering to be her guide, her teacher, in this most intimate of lessons, just as he had been in all the others. The fear did not vanish, but it transformed into something else, a trembling, hesitant curiosity. He released her hand and began to unbraid his long, black hair, a nightly ritual she had seen him perform many times. But tonight, it felt different. It was an act of intimacy, of shedding the warrior of the day to become the man in the quiet of his home. He then reached for the ties of her buckskin dress. His movements were slow, deliberate, giving her every opportunity to pull away, to say no. She held her breath, but she did not move. His fingers, calloused from the hunt but surprisingly gentle, worked the leather knots free. He eased the soft dress from her shoulders, letting it fall to her waist. The firelight kissed her skin, and she shivered, not from cold, but from a profound sense of vulnerability. She instinctively crossed her arms over her chest, a last, futile gesture of modesty. He did not look at her with the hungry, appraising eyes she had always imagined a man would have. He looked at her with a kind of reverence, as if he were seeing something precious and new. He gently took her wrists and unfolded her arms, his touch a silent request for trust. "You are not a thing to be hidden," he whispered, his eyes warm and soft. "You are the woman I have chosen." He began to teach her. Then, his lesson was not one of crude mechanics, but of sensation and trust. It started with a touch, his hand resting on her shoulder, letting her grow accustomed to the simple weight and warmth of his skin on hers. He taught her that a touch could be a question, a comfort, a statement of admiration. He traced the line of her collarbone, the curve of her arm, his touch as light as a feather, awakening nerves she never knew she possessed. He showed her that there was no shame in her own body. He encouraged her to touch him in return, to learn the landscape of his skin as he was learning hers. Hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence, she traced the strong muscles of his shoulders, the hard planes of his chest. This was not sin, this was discovery. He laid her back gently on the soft furs, his body a warm, protective shadow over hers. He kissed her, not with the bruising force she had read about in forbidden penny dreadfuls, but with a deep, searching tenderness that spoke of patience and reverence. It was a kiss that asked, not demanded. It was a kiss that taught her that her own response, her own pleasure, was as important as his. He taught her the language of breath, the way a soft sigh could communicate pleasure, the way a sharp intake of air could signal a new and wondrous sensation. He taught her that intimacy was a conversation, a rhythm established between two people, like the dance by the fire. It was about leading and following, giving and receiving, in a perfect, unspoken harmony. Every step of the way, he watched her face, his dark eyes asking a constant, silent question, asterisk. "Are you with me? Do you trust me?" asterisk. And her own eyes, wide and luminous in the firelight, gave him the answer, asterisk, "Yes, yes." When they finally came together, it was not a painful duty or a shameful burden. It was the natural, inevitable culmination of everything that had come before the rescue in the storm, the shared meals, the quiet lessons, the dance by the fire. It was the final, indelible seal on the choice they had both made. It was a moment of profound, breathtaking connection, a quiet explosion of sensation and emotion that dissolved the last barriers between them. She was no longer Eleanor, the orphaned missionary girl, and he was no longer Lakota, the Lakota warrior. They were simply two souls, two bodies, telling a story as old as the stars, but making it entirely their own. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the warm furs. The fire burned down to glowing embers, listening to the sound of each other's breathing. Eleanor felt a deep, bone-weary peace, a sense of rightness that settled in the very marrow of her being. She was not used or shamed or diminished. She felt whole. She felt known, in a way that went far beyond the physical. She turned her head, resting her cheek on his chest, feeling the steady, rhythmic beat of his heart. It was the same sound as the drum. She realized, the sound of a life connected to the earth, a life she was now a part of. Lakota, she whispered into the darkness. He rumbled, his hand stroking her hair. Thank you, she said. He was quiet for a moment. For what? For the lesson, she said. You taught me. You taught me that this is not about what a man takes from a woman. You taught me it's about what two people build together. He tightened his arm around her, pulling her closer. It is the only lesson that matters, he said. That night, a warrior did not just teach an innocent woman about the pleasures of the body. He guided her past the fears and prohibitions that had kept her spirit in a cage. He taught her about trust, about equality, about the sacred, powerful beauty of a freely chosen love. And in learning that lesson, Eleanor Hartley was, at long last, truly and completely born. The idyllic peace of their new life was a fragile skin stretched over a deep and troubled reality. And it was only a matter of time before the outside world tore through it. The first tremor came in the form of a lone French-Canadian trapper, a man named Dubois, who passed through the village to trade for furs. He was a wiry man with a nervous energy, and his eyes widened when he saw Eleanor, her pale skin and hair a stark anomaly among the Lakota. He was polite enough, but she saw the way he watched her, the calculations clicking behind his eyes. He saw a story, a valuable piece of gossip to be traded at the next fort for a free drink and a moment of attention. 2 weeks later, the story found its way back to them. A hunting party, led by Lakota, encountered a group of prospectors on their way to the Black Hills. The prospectors were surly and suspicious, their hands never far from their rifles. One of them, a man with a tobacco-stained beard, sneered at Lakota. Heard you got yourself a white squaw up in your camp. Chief, the man had said, spitting a brown stream near Lakota's horse. Best give her back before the army comes looking. We don't take kindly to race traders out here. Lakota had met the man's insolence with a cold, dangerous calm, and the encounter had passed without bloodshed. But when he returned to the village, he told Eleanor what had been said, his face grim. The bubble had burst. Their private world now had hostile eyes peering in. The news rippled through the village, reawakening old fears. Chayton, the fiery young warrior who had always distrusted her, saw his worst predictions coming true. He confronted Lakota openly in the center of the camp, his voice sharp with accusation. I warned you, he said in Lakota, his gestures sharp and angry. This asterisk was a unchu asterisk woman is a magnet for trouble. Her people now know she is here. They will come. They will not come with trading blankets. They will come with rifles and blue coats. You have brought this danger to our families, to our children, for one woman. Several other men murmured in agreement. The fear was a poison, spreading quickly. They saw Eleanor not as the woman who helped smoke the meat and mend the children's moccasins, but as a liability, a white beacon that could draw the very wolf they had tried so hard to avoid. Eleanor, who had been scraping a hide near the teepee, heard it all. Each word was a stone thrown at the fragile house of belonging she had so carefully built. She wanted to run, to hide, but she forced herself to keep working. her scraping motions becoming faster, more aggressive, her knuckles white. She would not let them see her fear. It was an unseasonably warm afternoon a week later when the real trouble came. A lookout from the hills rode into camp at a gallop. His horse lathered in sweat. He shouted the alarm riders approaching, a dozen of them, white men, armed and moving fast. The camp exploded into controlled chaos. Women gathered their children, their faces tight with fear, and hurried them into the largest, most defensible teepee. Men grabbed their bows and rifles, their movements swift and economical. There was no panic, only the grim, practiced efficiency of a people who had lived with the threat of violence for generations. Lakota found Eleanor, his face a mask of stone. He pushed a knife into her hand. "Go with Mika and Kanku," he ordered. "Stay inside. Do not come out, no matter what you hear." Mika was crying, her small face buried in Eleanor's dress. Eleanor scooped the child into her arms, her own heart a frantic drum against the girl's small back. Kanku grabbed her arm, her old eyes blazing with a fierce, protective fire, and pulled her toward the designated teepee. From the flap of the teepee, Eleanor watched as Lakota and a dozen other warriors, including a grim-faced Chaitin, formed a line at the edge of the village, their bodies a living wall between their homes and the approaching threat. The white men reined in their horses just outside bow range. They were a rough-looking posse, not soldiers, but hard-bitten ranchers and prospectors, their faces grim with self-righteous certainty. Their leader was a big bull-necked man with a fiery red beard and a booming voice that carried across the prairie. "We've come for the white woman," he bellowed, his rifle held across his saddle. "We know you're holding her captive. Send her out now, and we'll leave you in peace. Try to stop us, and by God, we'll burn this whole heathen camp to the ground." Eleanor's blood ran cold. Asterisk, captive asterisk. They had twisted her story, her choice, into a sordid tale of violation to justify their own violent intrusion. Lakota stepped forward, his hands empty and open at his sides to show he was unarmed. "There is no captive here," he called back, his English clear and strong. "The woman you speak of is with us by her own choice. This is her home. You have no business here. Leave now." "Lies," the red-bearded man roared. "An Indian's word is worth less than dirt. She's a decent Christian woman, and you've corrupted her. We're here to save her soul." A tense, terrible silence fell. The two groups faced each other, two worlds poised on the brink of a bloody collision. Eleanor, holding the trembling Mika, knew with a sickening certainty what was about to happen. These men hadn't come to talk. They had come for a fight, fueled by a righteous fury that would not be reasoned with. The breaking point was a small, stupid thing. A nervous horse from the posse shied, and its rider jerked the reins, accidentally discharging his rifle into the air. The single shot shattered the fragile peace. It was all the excuse the posse needed. With a collective, rage-filled yell, they spurred their horses forward, raising their rifles. The Lakota warriors met their charge, arrows leaving their bows in a silent, deadly swarm. The world outside the teepee dissolved into a nightmare of sound and fury, the boom of rifles, the whiz of arrows, the screams of men and horses, the Lakota war cries. Inside, the women and children huddled together, a collective knot of terror. Mika was sobbing, her small body shaking uncontrollably. Eleanor held her tight, whispering reassurances in a language she barely knew, her own mind reeling. This was her fault. Chaitin was right. She had brought this here. Her presence, her very existence, was the spark that had lit this fire. Then, through the chaos, she heard a cry of pain that was horribly, intimately familiar. She scrambled to the tippy flap and peered out. Lakota was down on one knee, blood streaming from a deep gash on his forehead where a bullet had grazed him. He was struggling to get up as one of the white men, dismounted, charged at him with a long hunting knife. Everything stopped. The voices of reason, of fear, of self-preservation in her mind went silent. There was only one thought, one imperative *him*. She didn't remember making a decision. One moment she was inside the teepee. The next, she was running out into the heart of the maelstrom, the knife Lakota had given her clutched in her hand. She screamed, a raw, primal sound she didn't recognize as her own. The man with the knife, startled by the sudden appearance of the very woman he thought he was rescuing, hesitated for a split second. It was all the time Lakota needed. He surged to his feet and slammed his shoulder into the man's chest, sending him sprawling. Eleanor didn't stop. She ran and planted herself directly in front of Lakota, a small, defiant figure in a buckskin dress, her hair wild around her face, the knife held awkwardly but resolutely before her. She faced the red-bearded leader, who had reined in his horse in shock, his mouth agape. "Leave us alone!" she screamed, her voice raw with a fury she didn't know she possessed. "I am not a captive. Can't you see I am home?" The fighting faltered. Both sides, momentarily stunned by the insane bravery or foolishness of her act, paused. The red-bearded man stared at her, his righteous certainty beginning to crack. This was not the frightened, cowering victim he had imagined. This was a wildcat, spitting defiance. "He's bewitched you," Girlie yelled, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "No!" she cried, turning her head to look at the Lakota warriors, at Chayton's stunned face, at the fearful women peering from the teepee. She switched to the Lakota she had so painstakingly learned, her voice ringing out across the battlefield. "My heart is here. I chose this life. I chose this man. This is my family, and you will not harm them." She turned back to the white men, her blue eyes blazing. "I will not be saved by you. The only thing I need saving from is your ignorance and your hatred. Now go, before more people die for a lie." Her stand, her fierce, unwavering choice, had shattered the narrative for both sides. To the white men, she was no longer a victim to be rescued, but an apostate, a willing traitor. To the Lakota, she was no longer a potential liability, but a warrior in her own right, defending their shared home. The red-bearded man stared at her for a long moment, then at the grim-faced warriors who had regrouped around Lakota. Their arrows still nocked. He had lost 2 men, and the quick, righteous fight he had anticipated had turned into a bloody, complicated mess. The fire had gone out of him, replaced by a sullen, bitter anger. "To hell with you, then," he spat, his voice thick with disgust. "You've made your bed. Rot in it." He wheeled his horse around and, with a curt gesture to his remaining men, galloped away, leaving their dead behind them. The silence that descended on the village was heavier and more painful than the noise of the battle. The immediate threat was gone, but the cost was laid bare. 2 of the posse lay dead on the prairie grass, and 1 of the Lakota, a young man Eleanor had shared food with just that morning, lay still, a bullet hole in his chest. The aftermath was a quiet agony of grief. The young warrior's wife began to wail, a sound of such pure, heartbreaking sorrow that it seemed to tear a hole in the sky. Eleanor felt a hand on her shoulder. It was Lakota. The blood from his head wound had traced a path down his cheek, but his eyes were clear, and they were filled with a mixture of awe, love, and a profound sadness. He said nothing, simply pulling her into his arms, holding her tightly as the first shock of what she had done began to wear off, replaced by a deep, shuddering tremor. She had made her choice, and she had defended it. She had earned her place, but as she stood there, wrapped in the arms of the man she loved, listening to the sounds of a family mourning a loss she felt responsible for, Eleanor understood the true, terrible price of her decision. To love Lakota, to choose this life, was not an escape into a peaceful idyll. It was to step onto the brutal battleground between 2 worlds. It meant shouldering the hatred of the people she was born to, while forever carrying the burden of the danger her presence brought to the people she had chosen. Her love was not a harbor. It was a vow to stand with him in the heart of the storm, for as long as it might rage. In the heavy, grieving quiet that followed the bloodshed, Eleanor's place in the village was cemented not in joy, but in shared sorrow. The funeral for the young warrior, whose name was Wanbli, was a somber, communal act of mourning. There were no sermons or scripture, only the low, keening songs of the women and the stoic, grief-etched faces of the men. Eleanor stood among them, Mika's small hand clutching hers, and she did not feel like an outsider. She felt the loss as a sharp, personal pain, a wound in the heart of the family that had taken her in. Her guilt was a heavy stone in her gut, a weight she was certain she would carry forever. After the rites were over, as the village tried to find its way back to the rhythms of life, Chaitan approached her. She braced herself for the accusation she felt she deserved. The bitter "I told you so." He stopped before her, his face grim, the angry fire in his eyes banked to a low, sorrowful ember. "You fought," he said in Lakota, the words stark and unexpected. "You ran out to stand before him. I saw." Eleanor could only nod, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. "My anger was at the danger you brought," he continued, his gaze unwavering. "But the danger came, and you did not hide. You stood with us. You have the heart of a Lakota woman, even with the skin and eyes of the asterisk Wasai Chu asterisk." He gave a curt, respectful nod and walked away. It was not an apology, but it was something more profound. It was an acknowledgement, a recognition. In that moment, the final wall of suspicion crumbled, not because of her usefulness with a needle or a grinding stone, but because she had been willing to bleed with them. A week later, as the first snows began to dust the high peaks, Takakota came to her. He did not propose with the flowery, awkward words of a white man's courtship. He simply took her hands, her calloused, scarred, capable hands in his. "It is time," he said, "for our two spirits to be tied as one, in the eyes of my people, and in the eyes of the Great Spirit." Their wedding was as simple and as profound as the land itself. There was no white dress, no church, no preacher, as the sun set, casting the world in hues of orange and deep purple. The whole village gathered around the central fire. The elders spoke, their voices weaving the story of their people, of the duties of a husband and a wife, of the sacredness of family. Kanku, her face impassive but her eyes surprisingly soft, came forward and placed a beautiful, intricately quilled necklace around Eleanor's neck. It had belonged to Tassina. It was not a gesture of replacement, but of continuation, an acceptance of Eleanor into the lineage of their family. Then, an elder brought out a large, brightly colored blanket. He wrapped it around Takakota's shoulders, and then Takakota turned and drew Eleanor into its embrace, wrapping it around her as well, cocooning them together. They were now one family unit, sheltered under a single blanket, their lives formally and publicly intertwined. They were married. It was a promise made not with words, but with a powerful, binding symbolism that needed no translation. But both of them knew it was not enough. Their life was on the fault line between two worlds, and they needed a foothold in both. "The paper is a strong shield," Takakota said to her a few days later. "Your people respect paper more than they respect a man's word. We need that shield for Mika, for our sons and daughters to come." And so, in the spring, when a traveling minister, a young, earnest man named Father Michael, far gentler than Reverend Gable had ever been passed through the territory, they sought him out. They met him not in a church, but under the wide open sky, by the same creek where Eleanor had first confessed her feelings. Father Michael was bewildered by the request, by the sight of this white woman in a buckskin dress, her hand held firmly by the stoic Lakota warrior. But he saw the deep, unshakable love between them, a truth that transcended his doctrines. And so, with Mika as their witness and the vast prairie as their cathedral, he read the familiar words from his worn little book. They made their vows a second time, a strange echo in a language foreign to their life. But it was a necessary magic. They received a piece of paper with their names written on it, a document that declared Eleanor Hartley and Lakota to be husband and wife in the eyes of the United States government. It felt flimsy and insignificant compared to the weight of the blanket, but they guarded it like a precious talisman. With that final knot tied, Eleanor's new life truly began. The woman who had once been useless on the frontier became an essential part of her community, a bridge between the world of her birth and the world of her heart. She found a purpose that synthesized her past and her present in a way she never could have imagined. She began with the children, using charcoal on smooth pieces of hide. She taught them the strange, angular symbols of the white man's alphabet. She taught them to form the letters, to sound out the words. She would write the English word dog, and beside it, Mika would draw a picture of one, and an older boy would write the Lakota word, *sunka*. It was a classroom without walls, a place of joyous discovery where two languages, two ways of seeing the world, learned to live side by side. Her skills soon became invaluable to the adults. When the treaty agents came from the fort with their papers full of complicated words designed to confuse and deceive, Eleanor was there. She would sit with the elders, her brow furrowed in concentration, and read the documents aloud, translating the legal trickery into plain, honest Lakota. She exposed their lies, their broken promises, their land grabs hidden in fine print. She could not stop the relentless tide of the white man's world, but she could help her people navigate its treacherous currents with open eyes. She wrote letters for them, letters to traitors, to the army, to far-flung relatives, her penmanship. Once a pointless parlor trick, now a vital tool for communication and survival. Years flowed into one another like a river. Mika grew into a strong, beautiful young woman, her mind as sharp as her mother's, her spirit as free as her father's. Fluent in 2 languages, at home in 2 worlds, Eleanor and Lakota had 2 sons, boys with their father's dark eyes and their mother's quiet determination. Her love for him did not fade. It deepened, weathered by shared hardships and enriched by shared joys, until she could not remember a time when her heart did not beat in rhythm with his. She had learned that true love was not a single, passionate declaration by a moonlit creek. It was a daily choice. It was the quiet mending of a moccasin, the sharing of the last piece of meat, the steadfast presence of a hand to hold in the deep, silent dark. One late autumn afternoon, many, many years later, Eleanor sat outside her teepee, which was now old and smoky dark, a comfortable home filled with a lifetime of memories. Her hair was a river of silver, her face a beautiful, wrinkled map, but her blue eyes were as clear and vibrant as ever. A young woman sat with her, a girl from the fort whose name was Sarah. She was little more than 16, her face pale with distress. Her family had arranged a marriage for her, to a much older, wealthy rancher she despised. She was trapped, just as Eleanor had once been, and in her desperation, she had sought out the wise white woman of the Lakota that people whispered about. "I don't know what to do," the girl said, her voice choked with tears. "It feels like there's no way out. To obey them is a kind of death, but to defy them, I'll have nothing. I'll be all alone." Eleanor looked at the girl, and in the tear-streaked face, she saw a ghost of herself, a frightened young woman standing on a dusty porch in Willow Bend. She took the girl's soft, trembling hand in her own gnarled, strong one. "The world will always try to tell you who you are and what your path must be," Eleanor said, her voice a low, raspy whisper. "It will offer you cages and call them safe homes. It will offer you servitude and call it duty. I, too, was once given a choice between 2 kinds of cages." "What did you do?" Sarah asked, her eyes wide. A slow, gentle smile spread across Eleanor's face, a smile full of memory and a deep, abiding peace. She looked out at the rolling prairie, at the land that had nearly killed her and had ultimately given her a life more real and full than any she could have ever dreamed. "I chose a 3rd path," she said, I chose to walk into the storm. I was alone, and I was terrified. And then I was found. I was found by a man who did not see a burden, but a spirit. He carried me to safety. He bound my wounds, and he shared his fire with me. And that night, in a cave on the prairie, a Lakota warrior taught me not just about love, but about how to truly live. Thank you for listening to this story. I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from. So please leave a comment below to say hello and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this journey, be sure to subscribe to my channel, Wild West Tales, and give this video a like. And if you'd like to help even more, please hit the hype button to help this story reach more listeners just like you.